Peace be with you, my friend. I'm Bob Wilhelm, and I'm a storyteller. This Sunday is the next step in the Lenten journey, and it's a story for the Second Sunday, Cycle A, that is rooted in the traditions of baptism. It's also, as well as being the Second Sunday of Lent, the first Sunday in the cycle of scrutinies, that is the steps, the liturgical steps of initiating someone into the Christian community. And so, since initiation is done by baptism, the image of water is particularly important. And that's why the image of the Jews wandering through the Sinai desert and the miraculous appearance of water for them is part of the storytelling for this Sunday. Let me talk about the background to the story first, because it's a very interesting background. The story is based on a Jewish midrash. And so the question is, well, what is a midrash exactly? There are many answers to that, but I want to focus on one particular kind of way that midrash is used. So midrash is a way of interpreting, and it's a way of interpreting a text, a sacred text. It could be a way of interpreting the law, or it could be a way of interpreting some event in Scripture that illuminates the deeper meaning of that Scripture. And that is what this story is, the story of Miriam's well. So a midrash works like this. In the Hebrew language, the root of the language are a number of consonants. Most words are three consonants that have vowels inserted in order to express the word itself. But what's so important about this may seem very unimportant if you speak English or Spanish or French. What's so important about these Semitic languages is that in their written form, the vowels alone are omitted and the consonants are not. So the letters for Jehovah or Yahweh are there, but the vowels that make it either Jehovah or Yahweh, depending on which vowels are used, will determine the meaning of the word. So there's a lot of interpretation that comes from simply reading the Hebrew text in Hebrew. And while today there are little notations, little marks that indicate what the vowel sounds are, originally there were only consonants. So just try to imagine reading a text in your own native language that has no vowels in it. In other words, you're going to have to do some deciphering as you're reading. You're going to have to figure out what those vowels are. So for example, there might be in English a word like thanks, which we might abbreviate with something like TNX, or just eliminate the vowel, or many examples of how you might shorten a word, especially if you're texting. In the reading of Hebrew Scripture, the vowels have to be provided. And this results in a very profound spirituality. That is, our heritage as being descendants of that tradition of the people of Israel, regardless of the language that we speak. But our heritage is rooted in the spirituality of a people who use language in a certain way. So when a person read from the Scripture, from the Torah, they had to provide the breath, the vowels, into the consonants. The consonants are dead. They cannot be pronounced without breath, without vowels. And so to read the Torah in the Hebrew tradition means looking at those letters and breathing life into them, breathing the vowels, ah, oh, E, all those vowel sounds that are sounds generated by breath. And so the spirituality behind this is that when we read Scripture, we need to have the breath of God, because God is the ultimate interpreter of Scripture. We want to know what God means in this revelation that we call Scripture. So we can't really provide our answer. We have to know what the divine answer is, and then we respond to that in our own ways. So in the story of Miriam's well, there is a way of working with the biblical text in the book of Exodus as a midrash. And just to make it as clear as possible, the story indicates that there were a few times in the 40 years of wandering that the Jews were miraculously given water to drink. And of course we know about the manna that fell down, food to eat. But the water is mentioned 3 times in reference to 3 places. And as you're reading the text or reflecting on the text, you will most likely at some point ask the question, well, what did they do the other times? 40 years and only 3 times there's the direct intervention of God. And of course the answer is that God is always present. And this is the deep spirituality of the story. God is always present, not just in the miraculous events, but in the ordinary, everyday events. And so if the story hinges on Moses as being the one who is the instrument of God's extraordinary activities, who then would be the vehicle through which ordinary activities appear? And in Jewish and in Christian and in all religious traditions, there is always the images of the masculine presence of God and the feminine presence of God. And so we in Christianity have images in our own mind of Christ resurrected, Christ transfigured, Christ on the cross. And we also have in our tradition, as you can see behind me with the icon that I am making now, I have to say writing now, because in the iconic tradition you don't paint, you write, and I'll talk about that some other time. But in the icon that I'm painting now, there is the feminine, the presence of God's Spirit in the Theotokos, the Mother of God, who is the one who bears the Word of God into the world. And it's not surprising that as Christians, as we look back on the Exodus story, we see Miriam as being the complement, the counterpart to Moses and his brother Aaron. And so in Jewish tradition, and this is where the midrash happens, this seems like folklore, but it's really an interpretation. It's a reading between the lines, trying to understand where the breath is when you read the text. So, we have that phrase, reading between the lines, but in Hebrew it's reading between the letters. You read between the letters to discover the sounds that are in that, and by analogy, you read the text and you try to discover some of the deeper meanings that are in the text. That's what midrash is all about, and that's what Matthew does. Matthew, whose gospel we are journeying with this year. Matthew, writing out of a strong Jewish tradition, constantly uses midrash as his method of telling the story of Jesus. And in particular, it's in those first 2 chapters of the infancy narrative, as it is called by biblical scholars, the story of the birth of Jesus, the beginning of his ministry in the world. These are midrashic. And what does that mean? It means that Matthew went back to the Hebrew scriptures. He found clues in the Hebrew scriptures that foreshadowed and prophesied the coming of Christ. And he took those texts and he retold the story of the infancy of Christ in the context of those texts. So I'll leave that to biblical scholars, but for our purposes we come back to Miriam's well. The question is, where does everyday nurture come from for the people of Israel? And for us during the Lenten journey. We have a big ritual at the beginning, don't we? We have Ash Wednesday. And then at the end we have Holy Week. But what about the everyday journey through these 40 days of Lent, much like the 40 years that Israel journeyed through the desert? How do we nourish ourselves? How do we quench our thirst? And of course, here we come to the story, the New Testament story of the woman at the well who thirsts, and Jesus says that he will give water that will cause her never to thirst again. And in the story of Miriam in the midrash, God takes care of his people even in the everyday. And if Moses and Aaron were the characters who took the big center stage when it was appropriate, it was their sister Miriam, who was present in the everyday, ordinary way that God takes care of us. And of course the story then, because the story of Miriam's well is so connected with the Sea of Galilee. In medieval Jewish times, the medieval Jewish mystics would, reflecting on the biblical story from Exodus, ask, well, where is Miriam's well now? And since one of the centers for Jewish mysticism was up in Galilee, it was right by the Sea of Galilee. And they made the connection between the water in the desert and the Sea of Galilee. And of course, that leads us right into the story of Jesus, the fisherman of Galilee. But I won't tell you that story here. Listen to the sound files, either in the short form or in the long form, and journey through Lent and through the 40 years of the desert simultaneously. We reenact, we relive, we take that journey as our own. I'm Bob Wilhelm, and I'm a storyteller.